finally, a source of raw, real, and honest information on healthcare issues that matter most. Welcome to BS Free MD. From the latest medical information to how to stay sane as a doctor or a patient, no subject is taboo, no BS is allowed. Now, let's welcome your hosts, Doctors May and Tim Hindmarsh.
Okay, I'm flying solo today. Well, not entirely. We have Dr. Paul Alexander, who has a PhD in evidence-based medicine, joining us. My beautiful wife, May, is off on a little business trip. Do you know what can be an annoying process? Having to listen to ads in order to listen to podcasts. Do you know what's not an annoying process? Working locum tenens with Weatherby Healthcare. Weatherby experts streamline everything from credentialing to housing with industry-leading technology and know-how so you can simply focus on what you love, practicing medicine. Head to financialresidency.com/Weatherby to get started and feel free to keep your favorite podcast on while you're at it. And hopefully one of your favorite podcasts is BS Free MD because we bring the BS freeness to medicine. Dr. Alexander, welcome once again. We last spoke at the end of June talking about vaccinations in children, and we thought it would be great to follow that up. Give our listeners just a brief recap of who you are, where you've come from, and then we'll dive right into this important topic.
Sure. Thank you very much, Tim. Once again, it's a privilege and an honor to be on your show. And let me get straight to it. So, you can hear from my voice that I'm originally from the islands in the Caribbean. I did my academic training in Canada quickly. I did an epidemiology degree at University of Toronto, a master's degree, and then I went on to Oxford in evidence-based medicine. I did a graduate degree there, and I also did a little bit of training in Johns Hopkins in bioterrorism. I actually schooled under Dr. Donald Henderson, who actually eradicated smallpox. I was interested in doing a doctorate with him, and he actually agreed. But for funding reasons, I went on to McMaster, and I did a PhD there in evidence-based medicine research methods. My doctoral supervisor was Dr. Gordon Guyatt, who is the founder of evidence-based medicine, that actual term, and the practice of evidence-based medicine globally. I did my postdoc with him. So across time, since coming out of grad school, because I worked while I did my graduate degree, at times taking sabbaticals here and there, but I worked for 12 years at the federal government of Canada as an epidemiologist. During that time, I was posted overseas to South Asia on a tuberculosis, HIV, multi-drug resistant TB project. I ran that project out of Nepal, Kathmandu, but traveling around to like India, Pakistan, all of these different countries. I also worked, I think germane to this topic, prominent areas is I worked at WHO in their regional office in Europe, in Denmark, 2008, 2009, Copenhagen. I was stationed there looking at particular projects, risk factors, behavioral surveillance, etc. And the countries that I worked with, the WHO offices that reported to my desk were Russia, Poland, Turkey, and Ukraine. Subsequent to that, I worked for Infectious Diseases Society of America, IDSA, headquartered in Virginia, as their clinical practice guideline development person who trained their panel members who developed these guidelines in how to develop clinical practice guidelines. Also, a little germane to this was mid of 2019, WHO and the Pan American Health Organization, which is the America's arm of WHO in DC, reached out to me to ask me to help them develop an evidence-based training program for Latin America, low and middle income countries, and which I was doing that across time. And then when COVID began to rear its head in January, February, WHO asked me to change my role with them because at that point, no one knew what was going on, and they needed people who could quickly look at all of the evidence globally and try to come up with, make some sense of it and help them with their messaging for the globe. And they had no department yet set up, and I was the department. So my role changed to be WHO PAHO's evidence sensitive advisor for COVID. And I worked in that role. And around May, I got a request from the US government, Trump administration, to join Health and Human Services as a senior advisor on pandemic COVID, which I did. And I tried to balance the two with WHO and Trump to maintain both, to collaborate, and to see how I can be a benefit to both organizations while keeping within the conflict of interest policies. But across time, the ethics commissioner in the US government advised me that I would have to resign the WHO, although WHO wanted me to remain in that position. Particularly at that time, Trump was withdrawing, and they actually was asking me to broker, which was an insane request because I couldn't do something like that. Anyway, so since then, I left the Trump administration end of September, and I've been working, providing consultancy to various groups internationally on COVID, and working with the C19 group in the United States and Canada, where we are a bunch of maybe 1,200 doctors and scientists, academic scientists who have expertise in COVID, treat patients with COVID, and we push early outpatient treatment, and right now our biggest battle, which is the vaccine. So we discuss COVID 24/7 and try and inform governments and policy think tanks and anyone who are willing to listen to us.
Yeah, I'm part of the group as well, as you know, and it literally is it literally is 24/7. It never ceases to amaze me, the rich dialogue and the emails that come at all hours. And of course it goes. We have members in Australia and the UK and so forth. So there's people that are literally a day ahead of us, time wise, and it really is quite fascinating to see. What's gone on. It really it's really mind-blowing. So let's move on to something new since we last discussed, which is Pfizer has submitted some I don't even really want to call it necessarily data because it's so sketchy, but I guess it's data with regards to immunizing down to 5 years old. What can you tell us about that?
Well, I think Pfizer had submitted some information that came in the news last week about this, what Tim just said. It's very thin. It's actually laughable that because we have not actually seen the data or anything formal yet. It's just what's in the news, basically. And they're talking about looking at 2,200 kids over a 1 month period, I think, or 2 months, and they measured antibody levels, if I could recollect, and compared that to antibody levels in teenagers. So, just from a research methods point of view, there are many, many flags and many problems. Principally, there's no comparative, no control group. The sample size is small, but I think the glaring issue is the length of follow-up again. The bottom line here is in all of these vaccines, all of them to date, and particularly now their push for kids, they have not done the proper duration of follow-up that will help exclude harms. So the bottom line is we don't know for anyone how these vaccines will behave long-term. And I'll give you an example. This same Pfizer, as an example, brought out a vaccine called Trovan, Trovan. You may not have heard of it because they brought it out in Nigeria a couple of years ago, and to look at to reduce to deal with meningitis. And a bunch of kids died. And Pfizer had to stop that vaccine. And I think they're still right now settling in the millions, tens of millions with the Nigerian government. So, you have the Qatar lab incident in 1955 where there was tainted polio vaccine given to children and the catastrophic consequences. You have the H1N1 in 2009, a vaccine that caused problems for children, narcolepsy, and all these issues. You have a prominent one was the dengue vaxia in 2017 in the Philippines, where children develop plasma leakage syndrome because of that dengue vaccine, and so there are, and many died. So the issue is that these vaccine companies do bring vaccines that are very harmful, even when they do the safety testing. In this case, as Tim knows, our problem is that they've not done the requisite safety testing. So it's just we are going on trust. And then when people try to say, well, they've said that we are all in a clinical trial, so they're going to collect the efficacy and collect the safety data over these next 2-3 years. Well, there's a problem with that, because when you think about it, and they know what they're doing, they're fooling everyone. They know that they unblinded these studies by giving the placebo group vaccine. So these studies no longer exist. These studies are over. In 2 years, when the FDA gives an approval, let's assume they would, it will not be based on comparative data, because there's no comparative data anymore. The studies are moot now. They're junk, because they cannot assess comparatively safety over time. And that's the issue. So we're actually being led down an alley that there's no end to it. It's just junk science. And it's terrible, because as Tim raised, he went straight to the important point right now, that parents across America and across the world are dealing with, confronting the fact that here these vaccine companies, without the proper data and research, are seeking to vaccinate children who bring statistical zero risk to the table. So you are asking to vaccinate a group that has near zero risk of severe illness or death from COVID. They don't transmit it readily, and that's the data. Yet the vaccine has harms, as we see in the CDC own database for reporting, with all of the deaths and adverse events. So it is likely that children will suffer similarly. So the question is, why would we consider, what does it need for children to be vaccinated? And when Fauci in the past spoke about, well, we need children because the portion of children who could be vaccinated will add to the population level immunity, so we get to herd immunity. But he was misguided and wrong, flat wrong. Like on many things, Fauci is always wrong. So in this one, for us to buy that argument, we would have to discount the immunity from persons who've had COVID and recovered, so natural immunity. We'd also have to discount the 15 to 20% immunity that we know from cross protection, cross reactivity from exposure to prior coronaviruses, common colds, etc. When you add all these things together, now the vaccine immunity, assuming that you accept the vaccine is working, we probably have 70, 80, 85% immunity across America. So he doesn't need children's immunity. So that's a whole bunch of garbage. And the safety issue is a big problem. So my argument constantly, and I'd like to talk about it briefly after Tim, is we have to, as a society, consider our children immune already and already vaccinated, period. No vaccines.
Yeah, I agree. And, you brought up something I think is really important, which is this concept of cross immunity. And I was actually just discussing this with some of my staff yesterday and a couple patients that I had seen. And I think that we're in for a really, I don't know if we're going to have a really bad flu season this year. I'm not sure how you can predict that, but I'm pretty sure. And if you see some of these sort of leading hospitalizations from the summer, I think children are in for a really rough winter this year, and not from COVID. I mean, I think that there's going to be a lot of kids admitted with RSV, with influenza, with things, because we've had this year and a half where kids have not been around each other. I mean, children are little viral bombs. I mean, how they build their immune system is by being around other kids. There was an old an old analysis from years ago where, basically kids get a certain number of upper respiratory tract infections by the time they're 10 or 12 years old. So if you're in daycare, you get them while you're in daycare. If you wait and don't go to daycare, you get them when you start school. It makes sense. So this idea of this communal immunity that children develop is super important. It's a really big deal of why it's literally socializing your immune system. That's what happens to kids. Well, we have completely, aborted that for the last year plus. So I see ICUs filling up with children that have, RSV and these kind of things because they haven't been exposed to it. Their big sister, big brother bringing it home from school to the infants and whatnot. And I see that being a really issue. I'm really nervous that the powers that be are going to see rapidly rising hospital admissions for kids and blame it on COVID, which there hasn't been a shred of evidence that that's the case.
Well, I mean, three things. One, I had this theory and this argument I've been going with that by closing schools, children are such an important component that by closing schools, we actually cause the death of elderly people at home. And because children weren't able to bring common colds from school, the 4 or 5 every year, back home to the elderly who would become infected, tune up and tax their immune system so that they could fend off COVID much readily. So we have to think in a very sophisticated way when we're dealing with this virus. And the truth of the matter is that the argument that we must consider children already immune, I think, is a legitimate argument because we have children who are have such a robust and here's the key though. I speak here as an academic scientist. Tim is a clinician, so he's actually dealing with real patients. So I have to be cognizant of this. I mean, I could wade into Tim's world a bit just because of like knowledge and stuff. I don't see patients, but I can. But I know the COVID. I'm an expert at COVID in terms of the data and the science, so I can speak. But I have to give the credit to Tim. Let me explain it this way. This theory that children are Patel and Budnekeviv looked at the issue of the ACE2 receptor. The ACE2 receptor is the protein, the molecule that the spike protein from the virus uses to infect it. I mean, all of you listening to this have this out of your wazoo for the last 20 months. So you're experts now. The lay person is probably more expertise than Tim and I. And so anyway, the ACE2 receptor that sits in the nostril and the nasopharyngeal passage. These researchers, Patel, and they published in JAMA and showed that children, particularly young children, it seems to have an age stratified approach. Children have the least amount of these ACE2 receptors in their nostrils. So it began to paint a picture, at least to myself, because I tried to develop this theory of why kids should be considered vaccinated. And it showed that children lack the apparatus, the molecular apparatus in the first place. That's why they don't readily get infected or become severely ill. Then as I studied further, I found research, well, it's actually recent research by Loesk and his company that showed that children in the upper respiratory tract have this sort of pre-activated innate antiviral environment where their innate immunity is much more primed and sensitized to SARS-CoV-2, very nimble and very proactive and has the capacity to respond quickly. So that added a second piece to the puzzle to me to try to understand why children have been at such low risk for the last 20 months and it has not changed. I mean, Dr. Martin Makary from Johns Hopkins, senior epidemiologist, he's been banging away with the CDC and hammering them because he's asked for the data for the 350 children across America since the beginning who have been given a diagnosis of COVID and who died. And his argument has been that, well, one, CDC has not given them the data to verify whether it was causal or incidental. Okay? And he's arguing, look, in the UK, with their 25 odd deaths across the time period, all of the children had underlying medical conditions. When we look at the 12 or 15 in Canada who died, children, all of them had underlying medical conditions. So him and his team said, you know what? We set CDC aside, and they looked at all 48,000 American children, I think up to the age 20, classified as children up to the age 20, all of the 48,000 who were infected. And they looked at all of the outcomes, particularly death. So there were about approximately 350 of them got a diagnosis. And what they found is in no situation, in none of the children in America who have passed, were they well children. All of them had grave underlying medical conditions. And any death, I have children, I have a young 11-year-old, any death is very tragic, and I don't think a parent could ever recover. So we're not talking about something that's casual. We're talking about a catastrophic, devastating situation, but we have to talk about the facts. And these are the facts. And this is what the media is not telling you. So I was driven by all of this, and I was trying to understand, with this low risk, I had already found the Patel evidence about the lack of ACE2. I found the low study about the heightened upper respiratory tract pre-activated innate immune system. Then I went further and I found some research by Yang et al. And they looked at, they found that they had collected blood, incidentally, a couple of years before SARS-CoV-2 reared its head in February of 2020. So they had blood from children. And they actually looked at the blood and found that in that blood, there were B cell immune cells, memory B cells that were prime and reactive to SARS-CoV-2 today. So it meant that children had seen this virus in some manner even before it emerged in February 2020. When I say seen it, the immune system, but not this identical coronavirus, but common cold coronaviruses. And they had this cross-reactive, cross-protection that Tim was just discussing. So I was very excited about that because the pieces of the puzzle was coming together to me that there was a molecular and biological basis for children having such low risk. I mean, we had the data out of Sweden, Ludvigsen, who published that they looked at all 2 million Swede kids, 16 years and under, across the pandemic, and with no lockdowns, no masking, no school closures, they found 0 instances of death, 0. And we looked at the French Alps study by Danis et al., who looked at one child who was positive and symptomatic and moved around to 3 different schools in France and interacted with 120 teachers and children from their classes. And they found no instance of secondary spread. So the data has been very stable and clear. The children it's not only that they don't readily contract this infection, but they don't spread it. So one more piece of the puzzle came with some research by Weisberg and Faber. And I remember from reading that paper, what they showed was that in their research is that children have T cells in there as part of their circulation that are very naive, and they use the word, if I can recollect, untrained. So much so that their naive and untrained T cell immunity allowed children to react very nimbly and very fast and proactively to exposure to SARS-CoV-2. So these 4 pieces of evidence by Patel et al., Loisk et al., Yang et al., and Weisberg and Faber et al., I decided, let me write this thesis that, consider our children already vaccinated and immune. There's no need for vaccine. Again, we had the observational epidemiological evidence, as Tim knows this data well too, across the last 20 months to show that children were not getting infected readily or spreading it. And again, Dr. Marty Makari's examination of all of the autopsy and case records using insurance records. They linked everything together to understand the deaths in children in America. And they concluded that no child who passed, sadly, but no child who passed did not have an underlying medical condition. And that's an important thing. And that's what parents need to understand. So this push by Fauci from the CD, from NIAID, and Dr. Walensky, Rochelle Walensky, who heads the CDC, or Dr. Francis Collins, who heads the NIH, to vaccinate our children is illogical, nonsensical, actually absurd and reckless. I say it's dangerous. And I say it borders on the criminality. Criminality is a very difficult word to use, but you need to understand what I'm saying here. And I want to be as blunt as I can. These people have no liability, none. All of the liability, all of the risk is on parents and on the child. So they have liability protection. So I'm saying if Walensky, if Francis Collins, and if Fauci are so sure and so confident that these vaccines are safe and that your child should be vaccinated, they need to put liability protection on the table and remove it. If you remove liability protection, us parents will be confident. But I am willing to bet they will not, because they know there's a problem with these vaccines. We are seeing it playing out in the adults. And if we bypass that natural protection the children have with the limited ACE2 in the nostrils, and we introduce vaccine at the level of the deltoid, and then that spike and the content of the vaccine enters the circulation and starts ravaging the vasculature, going to places, as Tim knows what the evidence is showing now by the Japanese data and all of that. We could have deaths in our children that dwarfs what we've seen in adults. I am saying if we vaccinate our children with these vaccines where there is no risk, we run the risk of killing many American children without any need to do so. This is reckless and dangerous.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's interesting when you were going through these sort of four concepts as far as to bring to the conclusion of children are already vaccinated and they should be treated as such. It brings another side argument for why masking kids in school is so insane. So let's assume the masks work perfectly. Okay, like they are an absolute perfect force field. You don't get any viral exposure. Well, then they would still be bad. And the reason they would still be bad is because now you're shielding children from, like I said, this socializing immunity that they get from other respiratory infections, which are critically important and part of how you develop immunity so that you're not sick all the time, to just regular upper respiratory tract infections. So assuming, using your argument that children are already essentially vaccinated naturally to COVID, then take the masks off so they can get all the other diseases as well. Otherwise, you're forestalling all of this, and you're going to have, then the 10-year-old brings home to the 6-month-old or to the 2-month-old, God forbid, RSV, and that's a deadly virus. Again, interestingly, because I think RSV is going to blow up this year, what happened with the RSV vaccine? Why don't we have an RSV vaccine? Because they tried to develop the RSV vaccine. They gave it to kids. Initially, it looked fantastic. It had great antibody response, just like what they're showing with Pfizer when they gave it to 5-year-olds. It had a great antibody response. But then, whoopsie, once they started vaccinating kids in the rest of the study, they died at a higher rate than the unvaccinated kids because it caused ADE. And it was more dangerous. So this has been like, how long have we known about the RSV virus? What, 50, 60, 70 years, something like that? We still don't have a vaccine for it. And again, it's similar to COVID. It's a simple, small, tiny respiratory virus. So this makes me really nervous. What do you think as far as the chances when you see how clearly the vaccine has not stopped spread in adults? What do you think the chances of, as immunity wanes and so forth, that we really are living in the world of antibody-dependent enhancement now?
Well, I think when you listen to people like Dr. Robert Malone or Gerd van den Bosch, etc., Byron Brittle from Canada, Dr. Brittle, you get the idea that we are fooling around with this situation, and we are going to be, as you just described, we probably are already in some version of antibody-dependent enhancement. And I think that brings back the issue of the vaccine trials. I think if I recollect correctly from reading, when they had made their submissions, they did not do the ADE portion of the studies. And I believe FDA, to cover themselves, wrote in their responses that the vaccine developer, they are asking or suggesting, they used soft language to the vaccine developers, look at ADE and study it. Vaccine developers took a pass. They weren't commanded, they weren't directed by the FDA or mandated to. So they didn't do it. So we don't have that information. And as I think Tim had suggested earlier, that when we looked at these types of vaccines 10, 12 years ago in the animal model, I think mice and ferrets, when these animals were challenged in the wild, and not even with the same virus, even with common cold coronaviruses, they got lung inflammation and liver toxicity, and many of them died. From 20% to 100% died. So we have experienced that these vaccines are a problem. These vaccines were never allowed to go further to the human phase. And here they come along and they get emergency use, and they have not done it for the proper time. I mean, look, let me share this. It's very interesting, but I mean, I think it's important. So one day I was in my office, and people came to me and said, "Paul, there's a meeting on the 6th floor. We're discussing the vaccine rollout." And remember, Operation Warp Speed was actually a heavy involvement by the military. So I'm not going to talk about details. I'm talking about the methodological flaw that is a problem with this. So I'm not going to give details, but let's just say that everything to do with Operation Warp Speed was heavily involved in the military, such that in the meetings that I attended, there were always heavy presence of military in my building, and which I felt was a good thing too, because they handled a heavy part of the logistics, so they needed to be involved from the beginning. So anyway, I grabbed my pad and I went to the office where there was this high-level meeting, because they were talking to the press, and the press was peppering the administration with the fact that how could you be bringing this vaccine in such a short timeline, 2 to 3 months, and we need 10 to 12 to 15 years. So the press was hammering the administration. So we had to have a response. And there was this high-level meeting that involved the press, but it also involved the actual persons involved in developing these vaccines for the US government. So when I arrived at the meeting, at that point, I did not have my security clearance yet for that level meeting. I had security clearance for other types, and they're very strict with this kind of thing. So that meant that I entered the meeting, and I sat down, was introduced, and everybody had to give who they are, what is their background, blah, 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 to the different government agencies. And the press was on the phone, all of the United States press. And then we had a lot of justice people, they're legal people, and they were going around to different people and they were requesting to give a status on your security clearance, what level, etc. So when I explained mine, they said, well, actually a couple of you all have to leave this room. I was one of them. So they said, at this point, you can't be in this office. So when I departed from the office with some other people, someone came to me and said, no, we want to talk to you after on some research methods. Someone on the US military side, because I used to discuss with them on the methodology. And so I made a lot of and there's not connections, collaborations. Anyway, so they said, can you wait here? So I'm sitting there, and I could hear the meeting, but I'm sitting on the outside with a couple of receptionists. And I wouldn't discuss the fine details, but I'll just raise something that's germane here. The press asked the vaccine developers, I wouldn't say which ones, I'll just say all were there. I wouldn't say who was speaking, I'll just say this. The press asked the US government at the highest level, how could we be bringing this vaccine to market with this short time? And the person who responded said to the press that, and I don't think he understood what he was saying, and even he was developing these vaccines. He didn't understand the research methods, and that's where somebody like me, that's why I was actually asked. He said that, well, we dealt with that by sample size. So what he was trying to tell the press, to appease the press, was we have increased sample size to adjust for the short duration. And then the press moved on to the next question. So after that meeting, I went to people that I reported to and senior people, and I said, listen, that's kind of insane from a research methodology, which I am. That is junk science. You can't circumvent time. And I explained it this way. I said, let me give you an example. What they just said, they were so crazy and so wrong. So let me give you an example of what they were trying to say, and they didn't even explain it, but I'll explain it, which will show you how wrong they were. And yet they continued on this way. It's the same exact trial that we got, same studies that they produced and gave to the FDA. So here's how I explained it. I said, if you had one study with a sample size of 1,000, and you divide it into two arms, a randomized controlled trial, 500 in each arm, so 1,000 sample, 500 each arm, vaccine, placebo. And if you run similar type study, so we're hypothesizing, and that one has 100,000 sample. Remember, the first one is just 1,000, 500 each arm. The second one has 100,000, 50,000 each arm. So, of course, the second study is a massive study, properly well powered, etc. Okay? The first study with just 1,000 follows its subjects up for 1 year. The second study with a 100,000 massive study follows people up for just 4 months. Yet, the safety events you're looking for generally happens by about 9 months. Which study would be more useful to you, even if it was the smaller study? Wouldn't it be the smaller study that is following the duration longer? Because the chance of rare safety events would occur. In that large, massive trial that they were trying to argue with the press that circumvented time, you will not detect those safety events. And that is exactly where we are today. Exactly how I explained it. And that's the problem.
You know, it's interesting because it reminds me of a quote by Warren Buffett, and I'll paraphrase it. And he says, you don't get a baby by getting 9 women pregnant and waiting a month. It's exactly the same principle, right? Like certain side effects take a year or 2 years or 3 years or 6 months or whatever the case may be. So the sample size is entirely irrelevant if there's certain side effects that you can't develop for months. Just like, you know, a pregnancy is a certain length of time. And if it doesn't go, you know, 34 weeks, 36 weeks, then that's called prematurity, or it's called a, you know, miscarriage, or it's a stillborn. And I think that's an excellent way to describe a lot of what they've done in this, you know, breaking the placebo. That one blew my mind when they basically stopped the studies and offered the placebo group the vaccine. That was just like, that was a mind, and that was several months ago. But really, this is stillborn science. That's exactly what it is. Because it's, you know, they literally aborted the study and say, follow the science. And I'm like, our podcast from last week was follow the science straight to hell, because that's what we're doing. And like I think we get into the deep weeds when we try to ascribe motive, but what is the motive vaccinating children? What's the motivator behind this, or what do you think the motivator is? Is it just money? I mean, I know James O'Keefe brought out some pretty interesting information last evening, with this sort of undercover sting operation inside Pfizer, and where they said they're largely a COVID company now. And I know I've done a little bit of speaking way back in the day, 20 some years ago, for actually, I think it was for Pfizer, for one of their products. And I remember talking to one of the guys inside, no, it was Lilly. It was Eli Lilly, talking to one of the guys inside Lilly. And he said, these companies are driven by one product at a time. They get a patent, they push it, they have all their other stuff that they still make a bit of money on, but it's kind of a one march out deal. Is that all it is? Is it just money, or is there something else?
Well, I look at it from this point of view, right? If you look at the budget of the NIH, I think it's about $55 billion a year. And Fauci has been there maybe 40 years, let's say 20 years, at a level where he was disbursing funds. So you're talking about $1 trillion has flowed through Fauci's hands. Now, who do you know of in government have that kind of immense allocation of resources? So that's serious resources. NIH funds all of the universities, all of the academic institutions, research institutions in America, all of the hospitals, etc. That's what NIH does. So similar to CIHR in Canada, etc. So I'll tell it to you this way. Many people from CDC and NIH that I know of, and even FDA, because of my stint in Washington, they told me even before I left that, like you get to talk to people and stuff, and they said, a lot of what you're saying, because, I would write to the FDA and write it, even from within, I would write to everyone. And I would give them different things. I would give them science. I'd give them my point of view, blah, blah, blah. I was not the decision maker. However, these people told me that a lot of what you're saying, people who were in those emails, is correct. But the problem, Paul, is that we as bench scientists or research scientists in the CDC or the NIH, etc., we cannot say anything as our career is over. And then I had colleagues in academia, even in Canada and across the United States, who told me that the universities at the highest levels, like the chancellor and all of the high presidents, would write to all of the faculties and all of the heads of the units and say, and make sure people understood, you have to be in line. You can't go against the narrative, because your unit or department will get no funding. None of the scientists would get their grants approved. Listen, it is a corrupt, incestuous. What COVID has done on Trump is he's fleshed out the hatred of him, helped flesh out the underbelly and the putridness and the rot of the system. It's a very politicized, biased. You see, we thought that your clinical doctor or whatever that you went to was we held doctors, etc., in the highest esteem in society. But we've come to realize that doctors are very political people, very biased, driven by, you are a clinician. So I'm not discussing you. I'm discussing the people who have stood by, the doctors and stuff who've stood by and not advocated for early treatment, in fact, worked against it. Those that are standing by today, whilst nurses in New York and California and all over are on the breadline, knowing that if as a fraternity, that they collectively sing with one voice, hey, Mr. FDA, Fauci and nutball at CDC and Fauci, you people are insane morons. No vaccine could trump natural immunity. So these nurses should have a right to make a decision, an informed decision. They're taking care of people daily. They know what they're seeing. And if they make an informed decision about their health, and they made a decision that they don't want the vaccine, most often they're already exposed and immune because of 20 months of dealing with patients. They must have been exposed. So We have 6 studies right now that shows us raw, Kramer, Matidiotakis, etc., that shows us that if you layer vaccine immunity on top of natural immunity, you sure likely will possibly end up in hospital. You increase your risk substantially. We have the adverse effects in these studies. So it is not just hearsay, and we know of a lot of people who've taken vaccine. There's a lot of reports out there, but we actually have literature published. So these nurses are correct, but the doctors are not defending them. This is what's staggering to me. No doctors are coming forward and saying to the government, stop this insanity. You people are wrong. You're crazy. Stop this junk about vaccine immunity here is better, or no, it's not. So we've lost faith in the profession, and the truth of the matter is this: if you went along with something and you did wrong, you are culpable. Like you're liable in some way. So it's almost as though they cannot they can't break ranks because they've all been part of this. But I think what is happening now is the public is so informed and people are so knowledgeable that it's almost like the gig is up and they can't break ranks, so they have to continue this on. The question is, what are they going to try to do next? Like Fauci came on the thing. It's the most ridiculous thing ever. I mean, this guy, I don't understand how he's not fired. He came on the media 4 weeks ago and said, oh, if we have these college football games, we're going to plunge the whole place into massive outbreaks and destroy everything. Well, it's been like 4 weeks since they started. Hundreds of thousands of people. In fact, every which way that you had a football game, the infections went down. So he's completely out of lunch, clueless. And it's just like they're trying different things to stick at the wall and see what could work. I think vaccinating children is, if they break us on that, is probably it's the hill we have to be prepared to defend, because the catastrophe that awaits children if what we're thinking bears out is unforgivable. And I think as parents, this is where you need to stand up and say, no. No one has prosecuted the case and made me understand why my 7-year-old child with virtually no risk should get these vaccines that are showing to have harms and have not been tested properly. It's as simple as that. Nobody has shown you why. So just close the door and tell them, no, get away from here.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think, the whole mask thing, which was kind of just stupid, having to wear a mask into a grocery store and, all that, like that was not a hill I was willing to die on. I mean, I'm just like, whatever. I mean, there's a certain amount of go along to get along, and I understand that. The place where I was like, okay, no, was kids. As soon as I saw the data with kids, I was like, not a chance. That one I'll, if they fire me, if they try to, go after my license or whatever with regards to kids, not a chance. Now I think there's probably going to be a new hill, which is the boosters, because I see, and I've told several people this in the last week. I said, like, mark my words, this is 3rd or 4th or whenever it was of October, that it's going to be an endless booster fest. It's going to be the antibodies wane after 4 to 6 months, and I predict that to push this narrative, it's going to be, if you don't have a vaccine within the last 4 months, then you're not vaccinated anymore. And if there is any measure of antibody-dependent enhancement, it's only going to make things worse, because we're really going to be putting gas on the fire at that point. I mean, I was vaccinated. I was fully vaccinated by the beginning of February. I got COVID in August. I went on Peter McCullough's early treatment protocol. I don't know if that made a difference, if the vaccine made a difference. I don't know. I was sick for 4 or 5 days. So I've got natural immunity. Absolutely no way I'd do a booster, but I wouldn't do a booster. I would recommend against it for everybody. I mean, I can't see how it's going to make sense, but I think it's going to be endless booster. That I think you can say with some confidence, at least right now, the vaccine is protective for serious illness. When you look at, you talk to people that work in ICUs, how long that lasts and whether it was a good idea to ever have massive vaccination of people of low risk. I think that both those things can be true. It can have some effect, but it can be the worst public health disaster in the history of mankind at the same time, because you're vaccinating your entire population and you're vaccinating people that didn't need it at all.
Yes, it's and that's an argument that I've made. Even whilst in DC, I said, no one under 70 should be a candidate for these vaccines. Especially if you're healthy and well. No doubt, somebody has to make a decision based on a discussion with their own physician and their own being themselves well informed, but of the benefits and the risks, which has not happened. I argue basically no one has been properly informed and consented. But the truth of the matter is that now, when I look at the data from VAERS, when I look at the data from Vigilance in Europe, and you listen to all of the reports, there's this study I was looking at this morning in the BMJ about the vaccine affecting fertility and causing bleeding, etc. It's I have to say that I'm not in support of it anymore, in the sense that, in the sense that if we had, look, my approach from February of 2020 to today, and I worked with people like Scott Atlas, I know I'm a friend of Dr. J. Bhattacharya, I know Dr. Martin Kulldorff, all these people. So our focus has been very simple, and I will clarify it again. Once we properly secure the vulnerable, you protect the vulnerable properly. We've never done that in America, Canada, the UK. Most our old age homes and nursing homes were the killing fields. We killed a lot of people, thousands of people there. We allowed staff to enter these facilities and staff were infected. I'm not blaming staff, because a lot of them are very poor people. They work 3 to 4 different facilities and they jump around and they bring infection in. But we told them, we told the US government, continuously told them. I even wrote to the Canadian government, said, stop the staff from entering the facility. Find a way. Use models that Europe uses, which is separate the staff, give them a complete wing or a floor in the facility, isolate them so that during the outbreak they don't leave and bring anything back for 2 weeks at a time. Pay them. If they can't for personal reasons, let them stay home, but still pay them. Don't fire no one. Then turn to the nursing schools. Those nursing students, they want money and they want practical experience. Let them come and pick up the shift and pay them also properly. So they have models that work. You properly secure the elderly. If you have your mother or your father or your grandparent in your home, you use creative approaches. What I mean is, if they have a bunch of young people in the home, for the time being, and they go out a lot and whatever, you make rules. You can't go next to granny, etc. Blah blah blah. Granny doesn't have to live in isolation. People make adjustments in the home so granny can still go in the yard and enjoy the fresh air and sit down and watch some television, whatever. Make common sense decisions so you properly secure granny. We never did. We killed tens, hundreds of thousands of our elderly. Hundreds of thousands of them. Second, whilst you're properly securing granny and grandpa for the first time in your private home or in the nursing home, you make early outpatient treatment available to them. From the minute they get infected or show any symptoms, you start the treatment. Right there in that 2-week window, it prevents hospitalization and death dramatically. The point is that all of the evidence suggests that from the time you get to the hospital in an advanced state, your chance of death increases substantially. So you don't want them to go to the hospital, because if you could treat them at home. So again, you properly secure granny, you make early treatment available. Number 3, whilst you're doing that, you public service the society on vitamin D supplementation and the need to live healthier lives, better nutrition diet, cut some body weight. 10, 15 pounds will make a huge difference. public service to the Black and the brown communities in America and wherever about the vitamin D. T-cell immunity, we have the science now published that shows that the T-cell immunity does not differentiate. They remain in a naive state if vitamin D is not in the cell. So the receptors they glom on to the vitamin D. So we know the role of vitamin D. We know the role. We found Magro, Magro et al. Their research group showed that the ACE2 receptor is most heavily expressed in brain tissue and next adipose tissue. And that's why it gave an explanation as to why, and then other tissue like ovaries, testes, endometrium, etc. But that's why it helped us understand why morbidly obese persons accounted for so much of the death in the United States, in Canada, in Britain, and these places. Most of the persons who died were excessively overweight. And I mean, that's a discussion that we have to have as a society. We have to be honest about these things. So again, properly secure granny in the nursing home, offer early treatment, public service, vitamin D and body weight control. And the last part, the fourth part, to me, which is the most important, is you allow the entire rest of society, the infants, children, teenagers, young persons, middle-aged persons who are well and healthy, to live largely unfettered lives, free from any of these lockdowns and school closures and all these mask mandates, garbage and social distancing. Let the healthy in society do what we always do. We always did with epidemics before. We strongly protect the vulnerable, and we let the rest of society live naturally, face the pathogen. You're much able. Children are very capable of dealing with this. Delta now is 99% predominant, but it's like a common cold. Children will effectively deal with it, and they'll be immune. They'll be immune from all the other variants, etc. So that is and you take a couple extra steps. You stop all the PCR testing. It's garbage. The 95-97% false positive. Just throw it away. And you just wake up tomorrow morning and say, that's it. It's over. If anybody has any illness, anybody has symptoms, they go to the hospital. You people ask us for 2 weeks to bend the curve. You, Vice President Pence, you said give us 2 weeks to bend the curve in March. It's been 19 months. You said those 2 weeks you're going to ramp up the hospitals and get a PPE and all that drama in place. You've had 19 months. You can't ask the public for anything more. The public has done everything you wanted and more. 19 months of suffering. We looked at all of the data on lockdowns. We looked at all of the data on school closures. All. I have all the science. I deal with it every day. We write every day. We looked at all the data on mask mandates. All. Every single comparative study. Every single report. Not one. Anywhere in the world. Anywhere. Any setting. Is there any evidence that they worked to curb transmission or reduce death? Nothing worked. All failed. It's garbage. We should have done none. We suffered people, especially the poor in society. We shifted the burden on them because the rich people, the affluent people, I know affluent people and they're actually pissed. When they talk to me, I actually think they're very perverse. We're not really friends, but they say, this is a whole load of crap now. I can't walk the dog as I used to. I can't go to the grocery when I want to, Why they opening up from the lockdowns? Leave everything locked down. Leave everything the way it is. So the affluent with their remote work and their remote schooling, they can hire tutors for their kids and stuff. They lived a very different life. It's very perverse when you think about it. We shifted the burden on the poor, and poor children suffered. Look, let me tell you something. We had reports coming up into the administration from different states across America. And you could have seen President Trump, and I applaud him because I could tell you he was fighting that task force daily, fighting them because they were fighting him to keep the society closed and schools closed. And he was fighting them, and I have to say, he waged a valiant battle. What you were seeing there in the front, you have no idea what's going on behind the scenes. In my building at the HHS, I knew because I was in a lot of those conversations. And let me tell you this, President Trump was seeing business owners in America committing suicide. We were getting the report. Employees in those businesses who were laid off were committing suicide. We were getting reports of children across America self-harming 300-400%, and many children committed suicide. Many people hung themselves. The media didn't report it because it was coming up to the election. So if they reported it, then everybody would be against the lockdowns. So they had to keep everything quiet. It was just Trump out there fighting. Okay? So I have to say something. I want to be as clear. I took that position in DC when I was asked because I am an immigrant. I have family on my mother's side who blacker than the night sky, and I love them. It's my family. So I come, that runs deep inside of me. So when I saw what President Trump, when I went and I saw him, what I learned, the things that he did, the media never reported what he did for minorities, for poor people, for in terms of economy and their future prospects. I thought in January of 2020, if everything that he had set in place and he got a second term, he was able to finish, he would have made a credible argument to be on Mount Rushmore. And that was no joke. Save Abraham Lincoln. Trump did more in the second 2 years he really accomplished. It was really remarkable because his first 2 years was shot. I don't care who supports Paul Ryan. Paul Ryan harmed President Trump. He made sure that President Trump's agenda didn't move forward. I know enough about the politics I could speak. Nothing Trump wanted to do when Paul Ryan was Speaker. Remember, Trump had the House and Senate. He had a blank check, yet he couldn't get nothing moved with Paul Ryan there. It's his second 2 years. So when you think about it, you have to marvel at what he did. Now, I have to say, huge love for President Trump. I would support him. I'd vote for him. I support him. But he made a catastrophic failure and blunder with these vaccines. And it takes a unique individual to be able to understand that and to stand up to it. I think President Trump needs to come to the nation and make sure that he says with his own voice, not for the children. At least start there. I think so. Now, I don't know, Tim, your view. I'm just giving you my view. Because I think that his heart was in the right place. I think he was greatly misled by those senior advisors and those COVID advisors. I think he was snowed by the vaccine companies, etc. He's not a scientist. And when you run a corporation, you depend on people. And you depend on them giving you the best, accurate, honest input. And then you make the final decision. I think Trump wanted to fix this and help, but I think he didn't really understand the devils that he was dealing with. And I think he must be seeing what's going on. He must be seeing that the society is being torn apart with these vaccine mandates, where people are losing their jobs and all kinds of stuff. So he needs to come and put some order to this and make a statement. That's just my view. I could love him. I could support him. I could see the good and the great. I think he was tremendously great.
It's really interesting though, because I heard a commentator. This was like months before he won his first term, and he basically said Trump's going to go in and he's going to kick over all the troughs from which the pigs drink. And I was like, wow. And I think he started doing that. And there was a couple of things he didn't realize. He didn't realize that when you drain the swamp, at least half the swamp were Republicans that wouldn't support him no matter what. And the other thing is when you start kicking over troughs, you get a lot of slop all over yourself. And so, there's sort of that, there's a way to maybe do that a little bit more artfully. But I think the thing that you said before about the corrupt, naked underbelly is really, I trusted the CDC actually quite a bit, because I thought, that's like the military. If you get in a pandemic, you need to have kind of a military response. So it makes sense to have a bunch of smart people sitting in a room in Atlanta kind of figuring this stuff out. The FDA, I kind of had my doubts about, as far as just because there's so much money that runs through gigantic pharma, that how can it not be corrupted? But now I have virtually no faith in any of these organizations. I mean, like when you look at some of the, I've been involved with a little bit of small cap investing and some smaller drug companies with some really favorable things, and they can't get any traction at all because they just get mowed down. And now we have Merck coming in, Merck, the guys that started ivermectin in humans, and now they're retreading a 40-year-old drug and kind of doing some changes to it molecularly and remarketing it again. Okay, now it's the amazing COVID pill. Well, our clinic, just in this tiny town, we have monoclonal antibodies that, Regeneron, that works really well, that we can give to people and monitor them for an hour, and nobody knows about it. But patients will call us every day and say, "Are you going to give us ivermectin?" And I'm like, it's almost impossible for me to write a prescription because it'll never get filled. But hey, you can come in and we'll give you this medication that's politically totally acceptable, and the government actually wants us to use it, and nobody knows about it. Like, why isn't there's ads every day? You can't watch a football game without 10 vaccine ads. Why isn't there 10 ads for, Regeneron that actually works? That's actually early treatment. It just blows my mind.
Yeah, well, the thing is, and I think Dr. Ramin Oskwi, had recently shared a study that he dug up on this new, the joke that we're going around right now is not what do you call it, Molnupiravir? He's called it money peer review. And but Ramin shared a study that showed that this drug have some problems, some side effect problems, and I think we need to look at it properly. Remember, we've not seen the study, we've not seen the data, we've not seen the methods, nothing. We've not seen the adverse effects data. We need to see the comparative data to see what Merck is talking about. When they say 50%, they are absolutely talking about a relative risk reduction. I need to see the absolute figures, to see, you know what I mean? What the hell is really going on?
Exactly. Well, this has been really, really informative. I'd like to say it's fun. I always love talking to Paul, but it's also terrifying at the same time. But again, it's data driven. I mean, obviously we have opinions, we have political opinions, we have personal opinions, but as far as vaccinating kids, as far as some of these, vaccine mandates and so forth, look, this is data. And if you're going to follow the science starts with hypothesis, debate, and then data. But there's good data, there's bad data, and we have to flush this out, and we have to be willing to talk about it. And we have to decide as a society and as individuals, as this goes forward, what hills are we willing to die on? If it's masks or tyranny, I'm not sure that's worth it. If it's vaccinating kids where they really only have risk of harm versus benefit based on the data that I can see, then I think that's a hill worth dying on. Thank you so much, Dr. Alexander. Enjoyed this immensely. I'll be cogitating and going through this in my mind several times as I seek to give it to my patients and to our listeners. And thank you so much.
Thank you so for allowing me. I'm very privileged. Thank you.
Perfect timing to head to financialresidency.com/Weatherby for a streamlined locum tenens experience. Whether you're new to locums or a pro, Weatherby is here to get you where you want to go. Absolutely. And I can imagine that with what's gone on with COVID and the uncertainty in healthcare and so forth, that there'll be a lot of doctors doing locums. And so reach out to them. I've heard nothing but good with regards to Weatherby.
It's no secret that medicine is a bit uptight. That's why Tim and I created BS Free MD, to mix things up a little and have fun in the process. Besides, we are having these exact same discussions all the time, so we thought we might as well invite everyone to the party. If you really like us, you can get plenty more and maybe see one of Tim's cool tattoos on our Instagram or Facebook pages at BS Free MD. See you next time.
While we try to keep BS-free MD as raw and real as possible, we can't be held responsible for any medical decisions or discussions had as a result of what you've heard on the show. We know, bummer. But the truth is, we really do care about your questions. So feel free to reach out to us by email at doc@bsfreemd.com. I'm new to this because I'm by myself today, so I'm all by myself. I don't want to be all by myself anymore. That was horrible. But, you're used to it by now. Let me findy.